Welcome back to another episode of the Divine Ascent podcast. My name is Vivek Mathew, and today I'm here with Reverend Father Christopher Mathew. He's the Vicar of the Christ the Good Shepherd Church here in South Houston, and is the Assistant Vicar of the St. John the Baptist Church in North Houston. And before we begin, could you start us off with prayer?
Sure. Let us pray. Baruch our Christ God, as we come to you on this day, celebrating your holy resurrection, may you continually guide us and strengthen us as we begin this podcast through your Holy Spirit, guiding us to continue to study your word and study the faith that has been handed down to us by your holy apostles and through the church. May you continue to guide us in our conversation that helps us to grow closer to you, helping us always to walk in your ways, and that this podcast will be a light to all people who are continuing to search and learn more about the faith and of the church. We ask that you continue to guide us and strengthen all those who've asked us to pray for them, for the sick and the suffering, and those who are without, those who are struggling from all kinds of hard trials and tribulations, wars and famines, that we can lay them before your presence, and that your holy peace from above continue to guide our paths so that we can truly be children of light and children of peace. We ask in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, both now and always and forever and ever. Amen.
So, in this episode, we'll be talking about the first part of Indian church history, starting with the arrival of St. Thomas. So, before we even begin, who was St. Thomas?
So thank you, Vivek, for having me on your podcast and of Divine Ascent. It's a great blessing to be here. And then as we are talking today about Indian church history and the arrival of Christianity to the India, we're always mindful that the person who comes to enlighten the people of India is Saint Thomas, the apostle of Jesus Christ. That when we look in the scriptures, particularly in the gospel, and we see the calling of the 12 disciples of Jesus Christ, St. Thomas is numbered one among them. And so that he is there from the very beginning with Christ during his public ministry for those 3 years, and is there witness to his sufferings, his passion, his death, and his resurrection. So we know that even particularly within the Gospels, there's a few accounts where we see him speaking, where he's the one Christ says that he's going to die, in the city of Jerusalem, and St. Thomas would let us go die with him. At the same time, we know after the resurrection, he wasn't there on that Sunday of resurrection, but 8 days later, the Sunday following, we know that he's the one that confesses Christ as my Lord and God, right? Seeing the risen Christ. And so he's an integral part for the church in India, but the church as a whole, right? Because particularly like on that new Sunday, the Sunday after resurrection, we see that the faith in the risen Lord, right? It is by the confession of faith and the part of the doubt that he has that he wanted to see and touch himself, the risen Lord, gives us strength to believing in the risen Lord, right? That we know that he died and resurrected, and it's because of Saint Thomas we have that account of even amongst the disciples, the apostles, they give us that commitment to knowing and being with Christ and being in His presence, especially even after the resurrection. So, Saint Thomas has given us that blessing to be able to hear Christ tell to him, "Blessed are those who haven't seen and yet believe." And so that's us now of the church. Now like you mentioned, 2,000 years later, being blessed by the confession of Saint Thomas.
So, we know that St. Thomas has traveled to India in AD 52, but how did he know to go to India, or why did he even come to India in the first place?
Very good question. So we know when we look at the end of St. Matthew's Gospel, right? At the very end, we see the Great Commission of Christ before he ascends to heaven, that he commands the disciples to go to all the nations, baptizing in the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and bringing them to the knowledge of him, right? Him as the Savior, as the Messiah, the Christ. And so that is an important part, that they were going to all different places. And the particular church tradition teaches us that it was St. Thomas who was given the lot of going to India. So when we look at the early church fathers, particularly within the 4th century, like in the 300s AD, we have the writings of St. Gregory of Nazianzus. We have the writings of St. Ambrose of Milan, who write about where the disciples went. And they particularly say that St. Thomas, as tradition teaches, had gone to the place of India, right? And so when we look in the ancient world, India was that place past Persia, right? So it doesn't say specifically where in India he went, but it knows that, through the ancient world where they know where all the different parts were, when you think from the ancient world before Christ, when Alexander the Great goes and conquers all these lands, they know that India is the place of the Hindus, or the place past the Persian Empire. And so it says that St. Thomas went to that place, the place of India. And so that much that is recorded. And then, in addition to that, even in the Syriac tradition, in the Syriac writings of the third century, in the 250 AD, we have a work called the Doctrines of the Apostles. And in that work, it also specifically says, where each apostle went. And it says that St. Thomas was given the lot to go to India, right? And then when we look later, when we go to the 8th and 9th century, even within the Roman Empire, as Christianity has spread far past in there, we know that even the King of England, now that after they become Christian, he's writing to the Christians of India so that he can make a contact to help build the spice trade for his country, right? Because we know that in India, one of the great commodities or things that they provide to the world, particularly in the ancient world, was spices. That was a very prized possession, the thing to have, right? And so even in the 8th, 9th century, the Christians in England are writing to the Christians in India. So it's a very deep-rooted tradition from the beginnings of the first, second, particularly we see the writings of the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries, but even going all the way past to the 8th centuries, before the first millennia, the Christians of the world within the Roman Empire and Europe and in the West had a belief and understanding that Christianity was already rooted and planted in India.
So when you said that the apostles like kind of cast lots on where they were going, I'm thinking like they just like took their hand and stuck it in like a cup and just like draw like sticks, or like drawing sticks. But I thought it was. Correct me if I'm wrong. I thought it was Jesus appeared to Saint Thomas in a vision, said, "Go to India."
There's a lot of different traditions. When I said lots, it wasn't like they were picking out of a hat. It was more like where each one was going. It says the lot fell to India for him, meaning in the sense of his place was to go, because they're now at the council. It's not written down as this is how they like a board meeting. It said, okay, you're gonna go here, you're gonna go there. It said that each one went, and so like you said, it wasn't that Christ told him in a vision. He said, right, but then it says within that tradition, within the Syriac tradition, St. Thomas was like, how can I go? I don't know how to speak the language of those people, and that's outside the Roman Empire, which they knew, past the Persian Empire, which they heard about, and it's like that's kind of saying like the ends of the earth, right? So it says in that account of Saint Thomas, he says, I don't want to go, right? And we even have that within some of our songs that he refused, but it's in that Saint Thomas made us. So when Saint Thomas is very struggling, how can he go to India to preach? Even though this is after the Pentecost, it says that Christ made a way. So then there was a lot of trade between Roman Empire going all to India because of, like I said earlier, because of the spice trade. And so uh, Christ gets a trader to buy St. Thomas, to say, hey, as a slave, I have a servant that you need to take with you.
Uh-huh.
And then St.
Wait,
Thomas goes.
wait, who does?
So the Christ himself, it says in a visit, goes to, or God, like you can say through an angel, but it says Christ comes to this trader, and
Mm-hmm,
it says, yeah, I have a servant that needs to go, right? And so
mm-hmm,
then he gets on that boat and goes and travels with him to India. All these things being said, these are all different accounts of how they're giving accounts of how St. Thomas came. In the end, the biggest thing we said, we can't prove one way or the other how he came, like specifically came. But historically, we can see that there was a trade route that links, from Europe to the Middle East and the Holy Land, where Christ and the apostles were, leading all the way to India because of this trade. Even all the way to China, because we know the Silk Road going to the kingdoms of China and the Chinese kingdoms there too as well, right? And so we know that it's not impossible for them to go. It's a matter of the willingness to go, and knowing that was that was the command and commission given to them, right? To go to the ends of the earth. So we know that the disciples took that to heart, even though the stories kind of show kind of the hesitation of St. Thomas, and that just shows realism that they were real people. It's like thinking they're like, hey, how can I do this, right? Even though they know that they've been empowered by the Holy Spirit, they're still like just like us. They're like they think about what they can't do, right?
mm-hmm.
But we know that Christ always provided a way. So it never said that St. Thomas like ran away like Jonah. He said that he had that kind of anxiety there for him, which we can all identify with. But when Christ provided that way, he made his way there, right? One of the traditions, like in the Syrian tradition, talks about the trader that that took him with him. Others say, you can mention either by boat or by the land route. But in every case, the church has understood that Saint Thomas was the one who made sure it was his call to go and bring Christianity. And it doesn't just that he just only did India. On his travels, that's why which we'll talk about later. We'll talk about the Indian-Persian relations. He preached the gospel in all these places. So it's not just India that claims Saint Thomas as the enlightener of our people, right?
Mm-hmm.
Many places on that route from between the Holy Land, in Jerusalem and the Roman empires, all the way leading to India. All those places talk about the missionary activities of Saint Thomas, right? And they have that faith that it was because their forefathers were converted by the hands of an apostle of Jesus Christ, right? And so, and even as us, we say that he didn't stop in India. Our church will teach that he came in 52 AD, and then continues to preach the gospel. And then it says that he goes all the way back, goes to China and comes back, and then he's martyred in 72 AD in India. So the it just highlights that the apostles were faithful to the that as we see in the scriptures, to go to all nations. That Christ, the mission and the light of the gospel of Jesus Christ, was not limited to just one area of the world, like the Holy Land or Middle East, or to just one empire, which was at that time it was part of the Roman Empire, or just the closest empires that be a Persian Empire. It goes to the ends of the earth. The disciples, the apostles, made sure that they brought that to all places, and their disciples continue that ministry till we get to today, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a confirmation that the message of Christianity, of the message of Jesus Christ, was not limited. There was no limit to where it could go, right? And you can imagine now we can go all places, by flight, and now you don't even have to fly. Everything's now through internet, right? You can be in a place and share messages and ideas. But even at that time, God provided that way. Jesus Christ provided that way for his apostles to reach the places that he wanted, to make sure that it was no longer limited to just the chosen people. Now the message of the gospel was now to all nations, and so Saint Thomas did his part in fulfilling that will of God.
All right. So then, how do we know that, or how do we know that St. Thomas actually was in India, and this isn't like a fairy tale or a legend?
Okay, so like I said, we have those written accounts of the early church history, like Saint Gregory of Nazianzus, Saint Ambrose. We have the Syriac document of the Doctrine of the Apostles. We have other historical records of people, like I said, like King Alfred in England had written as he's heard that tradition of there's Christians in India. He's trying to make a play to kind of make a connection. Hey, we're also Christians. Can you help us in the spice trade? But that's a lot later, like in the by the 8th, 9th centuries.
But couldn't they just hear that from like a messenger? That like maybe Christians just traveled to India and then just
Right. So
stayed
like I
there?
said, though, like I said, so that just shows that it's funny when you think about it. We think we have the internet to be able to spread news fast, but you can imagine the Roman Empire and the people, the message of the gospel and the people, the news of things happening can travel far distances. So from India to England, even at that time, there was an understanding of messages coming through these communities, right, and the preaching, so that the early church was teaching that the apostles went to all these different places. They founded the churches in all these places, so that when we start getting to the establishment of the church now being as strong as the state or the main religion of the Roman Empire, we start having these ecumenical councils. And then we start talking about at the very first ecumenical council of Nicaea, it says there was a Bishop John who was representing to the peoples of India, right, or to that far reaches, right, that he came and attended. So that's already in 325 AD, right, and the first Nicene Council. And so it was from the early Christians, there wasn't a doubt that the message was limited to just their people. Like only amongst their technology or their ability to disseminate information was it limited. Right? It's like no, the as Christ commanded to go to all nations, and that through through the Holy Spirit, it was they believed and trusted it would reach all the way to India, even though they never saw an Indian person or they never lived in India or could see it directly for themselves. The church in India, they believed it because they're hearing it that there's Christians in India. And when they're having these ecumenical councils, there's people who are saying they're representing the peoples far east, right? As far as to the peoples of India, and so that strengthened for the Christians within the as we know, like the early Christians, most of the writings we have of the Roman Empire, it's showing how even beyond their borders, the Christian message was being disseminated right past their borders, right? And so, so then we start looking at the first historians. Even there's one explorer who goes, one of the first ones of the Greek peoples during that time. There's Christian topography, and they're going to different places where Christians had settled or communities were outside the Roman Empire, and then they see that Saint Thomas reaches, or the message of the Gospels is in India because of the preaching of Saint Thomas the Apostle, and so that community was there already, and that's by the fifth, sixth centuries, when he's traveling and they're seeing all these places. And so there's a very strong historical record in terms of these accounts of people, but they're like individuals, and then they're hearing these histories of, oh, there's Christians there, right? But it's a continuous thing. It's not like it's always being talked about that Saint Thomas had gone to India, right? Like that's always been when the early Christians are being taught about, oh, where do the apostles go? From the very beginning, they said Saint Thomas has gone to India. It's not something that only after the Portuguese come in the 15th century and the 16th century, that they're saying, oh, there's, now only now Christianity has reached the shores of India, right? It's already belief, a well-held belief that there's already communities there, right? And so even when the Portuguese come, they're not surprised that there's Christians there. They're just surprised that they're not knowing who the Pope is,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so that they had an understanding that they would come into contact with some Christian community. They don't know how many or how big, but there was, because of the church tradition and the history of where the apostles went, they already had a belief or an understanding that they would come into contact with some Christian communities.
But is there not any physical proof that St. Thomas was in
Right,
India?
and that's a good point. And so we know that when we hear the church tradition, especially even after the Portuguese come, by 1600 or the 17th century, with our interactions with now these European Christians, right? There's a song called the Ramban song, where this one Ramban, or this monk priest, had written down an oral tradition song that talks about how Saint Thomas comes to to the land of India, particularly to the Malabar coast, and he establishes 7 churches, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when you look at that song and lined up where these churches are, there are church communities in all those places. And one of the major one where this Ramban, or this monk priest, is living is in Niranam. And so that one of the major St. Thomas centers, particularly with our Malankara Orthodox Church, is St. Mary's Church, Niranam, right? And that when you go to that church, there's a big church that's there, and then the present building itself doesn't date back to first century or where St. Thomas is. It keeps getting built on top of and built up. But when you go to they have a small museum next door, and they have artifacts that lead back, going back centuries to the early part of Christians, of items from India of Christian communities there, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it just shows that from the very beginning there was a community that was surviving and living. At the same time, when we look at the historical records in India, and that's also another thing that we have to look at, because so far we've been talking about all the historical records of coming from European, or the Roman Empire, and from the churches that's connected to the West. But when we just look at the political identity of the peoples in India, already we start having we have still physical records or items of showing royal proclamations of Christians being in Kerala or being in the Malabar coast. And one of the biggest ones is that we have is, we by the 5th, 6th century, there's tradition that there was a community of Christians that were coming from the Middle East. There's a group under the person named Saint Thomas of Cana, right? They're saying he's coming from this regions of present day Syria, Palestine, right? And he comes to India because and there's 2 traditions or 2 reasons they say. One, this is because there was now at that time there's persecution of Christians by the Persian emperor. The Persian Empire, they're fighting Roman. The Roman Empire and the Persian empires are fighting, and they're living on that border. So then, where they were living now was under Persian rule, and there was Persian persecution happening on of the Christians, and so they're leaving to find a better place for their community, right? To survive. Another tradition says because the Christian community was kind of dwindling in Kerala or in the Malabar coast, they write to the communities of their brothers and sisters to the west, and they come. In either case, we know that in the Indian historical, in the Malabar coast, the kingdoms of present-day Kerala, those are historical proclamations of land given to these Christians who are coming, and they are serving amongst the Christians who are there, right? And so there are these copper plates in different places. One for this Thomas of Cana community, and also there's another in another kingdom that highlights the status of these
Mm-hmm.
Christian communities, because one of the biggest things that was unique about the Christians in the Malabar coast and the kingdoms of there's a handful of kingdoms that were present day Kerala is now on
Mm-hmm.
the southwestern coast of India. That they, when we study Indian history, there's the caste system. There's the high caste people and low caste, and so low caste people could never come in the presence or touch high caste people, or they'd be unclean, and so, but the low caste people are the ones who are farming and making and doing all the things that were needed for the high caste people, all the products and things they're needing, be it like plates or vessels and pottery, the wheat that's been gathered to be given so they can make for flour, making things and cooking things. It's ritually unclean if it's going directly from a low caste, untouchable person going to a high caste person. So there's always an intermediary group. The intermediary group, when we look in the historical record, was the Christian community, particularly in the regions of present-day Kerala. So the proclamations that were given was highlighting their status as they were the ones that go between. They
Yeah.
were the ones who they took what was made by the low caste people, they
Mm-hmm.
made it into things that were necessary, and they were able to give it to the high caste people without it being unclean. And so that even to this day, when you start looking at the histories of places in Kerala even now, or at least at least you can say 100 years. Now modern it's slowly changing just because of how things are changing in India now. But when you start looking over the centuries, even amongst these Hindu temples, there would be a Christian family living nearby.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting when you start watching videos of like about the histories of Kerala and the peoples. It was important that even at these festivals, be it Hindu festivals, a Christian needed to be there because they were the ones that were supposed to be able to hand over things to them. And so it's an interesting dynamic that happened. It was particularly in India, which is known to be a very pluralistic society. They welcomed so many different peoples and religions. They had a very structured caste system. There was the haves and have-nots, but when it came to religion, there wasn't a forcefulness of you had to be one or the other. They all found ways to make this. They fall within that system there, right? And so even amongst the peoples of India, Christians were being highlighted, and this is as early as these copper plates and these proclamations that by the fourth, fifth, sixth centuries, AD.
Say what the physical proof was.
Physical proof, the parts of where the churches are now that are still
But
existing. Physical things, we don't have physical records. Even when we look at
like,
India now,
mm-hmm.
it is particularly when you look at the south in the coast, southwestern coast. It's a very humid place, right? When you look
Okay.
at records itself,
Mm-hmm.
nothing. There's even amongst just Indian history, you don't find written records that last go about millennia like that, right? Or some of them they still extant. I remember when I was studying in India, we went to this one museum, and there was like this. There had this rolls of I forgot how you explain it. It's like pieces of bark or tree bark.
Mm-hmm.
It's the paper that time. Like it's paper, but it's still more cellulose, like plant based.
Mm-hmm.
And they have these small writings of Hindu prayers or historical records of different places, and it's very fragile now. Because it was just going a couple hundreds of years. I don't think it even went to 1,000 years. And it was so hard just to preserve that because at that time, a lot of things, in the amongst the Indian community, documents weren't necessarily kept to be preserved for like centuries, right? They have monuments and buildings, right? In like churches or in the Hindu temples or mosques, or places of worship or government, palaces. But when it comes to like written records, a lot of things it's very hard to, it's a lot of copying down, right? So
Mm-hmm.
but the things from before get lost, right? So physical evidence is if we have small little things here and there, um, nothing you can trace back to St. Thomas. Even St. Thomas himself, even though, like I mentioned earlier, he was martyred in 72 AD and present day Tamil Nadu in Chennai or Madras at the time, or sorry, Mylapore, which is near to Chennai, um, in the state of Tamil Nadu. So this is a neighboring state to Kerala. It's on the opposite coast, on the southeastern coast of India. Um, and then it says he was buried there, but then after so many centuries, it says his relics were translated from India to Edessa, and then from Edessa, which is present day like Iraq Syria border,
Mm-hmm.
and then when you go, and then it gets moved, and then his relics get moved during the
Mm-hmm.
Crusades by Europeans and later at a later time. But it's still, even that's to this day, even we celebrate July 3rd as a feast day of the church in India, but that feast day is celebrating the translation of the relics of Saint Thomas going from India to Edessa. So this in the Syrian calendar, it's a big feast day of Saint Thomas's remains, or his relics, as to say, being transferred. But it's when it's left from India to the city of Edessa, which is in the Mesopotamia, like the Iraq, or present day Iraq, kind of Syria, Turkey border. Um, and so, um, but the interesting thing says that when Vasco da Gama comes to India, it says that he's asking, when he gets to that part where he goes, oh, this is where St. Thomas was, but the people would take dirt from where he was buried and give
Mm-hmm.
it to people who were sick. So even when he comes,
Even the Hindus too.
yeah, Hindus and Muslims, they said they would go because they said it was a holy man who was buried there. And they
Mm-hmm.
said that the ground, the earth of that place was still like spirit, like had a spiritual
Grace.
power, right? And so it says the peoples who lived there, the village, they knew the tradition. There was a holy person buried here, but then it was taken away. But they still would take dirt from that. So if anyone is sick, they take it and put it in water and make them drink it to get better.
Mm-hmm.
And so it shows that even when he comes, because he's now looking, sorry, not Marco Polo, right? Sorry, when he's coming to all these places, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're finding.
Oh, wait, not Vasco da Gama, but Marco
Well,
Polo. Yeah.
but it's Marco Polo. I gotta make sure to accept. But when these European travelers are coming through, they're hearing these accounts
Mm-hmm.
of going.
So we know we have some level of proof, whether it's the seven churches, 7.5 churches he built, or the oral tradition of the Ramban song.
Mhm.
Um, but are there any folklore or legends of Saint Thomas in India?
Yes, there is. So there's different accounts that are accounted to St. Thomas during his missionary activities. Particularly in Kerala, one of the main ones that we see or hear about of St. Thomas, it says that when he comes to India, now that he's now established there, um, he goes and he's walking around trying to find people to talk about Jesus Christ. And so it says one morning, in those days, people will go to the rivers to bathe, right? Or
Mm-hmm.
to do their morning ablutions and pray, right?
Yeah.
So to wash up, right, for the morning. And so he noticed that he was at the riverside and he see these Hindu priests or the faithful high caste Hindus. They're there doing these prayers, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're going into the water doing their morning washing, right? The ritual washing. And then part of the prayer is that, it says that they cup the water in the river and they throw it up as an offering to God, right? And it sprinkles it up, right? And it's
Mm-hmm.
kind of it's a part of their piety, right? And as a prayer life, right?
And they would do this every day.
Yeah, they would do, yeah, that would be part of their routine, right? Of
Okay.
prayer for the days, right? And so when St. Thomas sees and he's looking, it's interesting. Okay, he's because as a good person, that you have to observe people before you just kind of go up to people, right? To tell them things, right? And so he's looking and watching, and then as he goes down and talks to them, so they kind of goes, "Hey, why are you doing that?" And they tell him, "Hey, and this is we're doing our prayers and we're making our offerings to God, thanking for the water and all those kind of things, right?" And it says they cup the water and they offer it to him, and he goes, "Well, how do you know if they accept?" And it says, they look at you like, "What do you mean? That's how we're taught to pray. Right? God is spirit, and it just goes, and then God provides back. Or there's
Mm-hmm.
no, they never think, yeah, how do they know? That's just part. That's how they're taught, right?
Yeah.
And then so St. Thomas says, what if I tell you that I can throw up the water, and He'll accept it, and I can prove it
Mm-hmm.
to you, right? that God is accepting my God will accept my offering,
Mhm.
of this water offering, right? And then I can make it stay, and you'll see, right?
Mhm.
And they're like, okay, you come in the water, right? And it says that when Saint Thomas gets in the water, he cups the water and he throws up the water, and it stays suspended in the air.
Mhm.
And then they look down, the place where he cupped the water remained like as a hole, like a divot in
Mhm.
the water. And then they're like, and they're like, okay, we believe in your God, because he actually
Mhm.
accepted, like a miracle happened in front of them, right?
Yeah.
And so that was one of the miraculous accounts that helped him convert
Mhm.
some of the early uh, Hindus in that region in Kerala. The other account that's given to us, and it says that during the time of King Gondophares, Saint Thomas is doing all these missionary activities. This king is wanting to build a big palace,
Mhm.
and he goes, I need an architect, right? Someone who
Yeah.
can build, right? And so I mentioned earlier, Saint Thomas comes with a trader, right? And so and he's well known to the king, and the king goes, I need a good person to build, and he goes, oh, the person who just came with me, his master was a carpenter.
Wasn't St. Thomas also a carpenter himself?
Well, it never says directly, but we say that because he was a disciple of Jesus Christ, who was carpenter. It says, well, my master, the person who came, he's a he was apprentice. He's a carpenter, right? Because
Mhm.
his master was a master carpenter, right? And so it's okay. And so it says the king gives him all this money to build, right? So his family was okay, thank you. Okay, he goes, I can do it, right? I can do all these things. And it says that St. Thomas is given the money. He doesn't go and buy materials to build a big palace. He gives it to the poor, right?
Mhm.
And so, and then after the money's, after he's going, it says that the the king, when he's looking for uh, his palace, after so much time has passed, and he's wondering, hey, what's happened with all this money I gave to this Thomas guy? Um, I need to see progress. And he calls in St. Thomas. He goes, is my palace ready? He goes, yes, I built a wonderful palace in your name. And he goes, where is it? He goes, well, it's in heaven. And he's like, oh, you conned me, right? And
Uh-huh.
so then he throws him in jail, right? He's very upset. He's looking to execute him and do all these things, like punish him, right?
Mhm.
Not just kill him right on the spot, but to torture him because he just made him look like a fool and took his money, right? But it says that at the same time, one of the king's brothers passes away
Mhm.
and it was very close to him. And it says that when he passes away, he goes to the afterlife, and then he's walking around and he goes looking, and it says that he sees this wonderful palace. He's like beyond measure, like you never see anything on earth like. He goes, whose palace? And he asks, and it says the beings around him, whose
Mhm.
palace is that? And he says, that's your brother's.
Mhm.
And he goes, wow. It's like, and says, well, he doesn't know that it's here. He's looking, and because he's thinking like he get bamboozled, like he get tricked by Thomas, right? And he goes, I need to tell my brother, and so they allow him to go back.
I
It's,
heard that there was tradition where it was when the brother saw it, he went back to buy it off of him.
that's part of it. He really wanted it, right?
Yeah.
But then there was no palace. So then when he comes back, it says that he goes, brother, can you? I want to buy the palace that Saint Thomas gives me. He goes, what do you mean, right?
Uh-huh.
And he's just like, what do you mean? There's no palace, right? And like he like bamboozled me. He goes, no, I want to buy that palace. And he goes, no. Like it's like, well, what do you mean, right? And then he goes, why are you so adamant? Because he goes, I I saw after that I saw this wonderful house that's beyond measure, right? That I can imagine is so beautiful. He goes, oh, and so then the king got it for it. Was like, oh no, I'm gonna keep that, right? But then it says the king's brother gives money to Saint Thomas as well, and he continues his missionary work. And it says another palace, just like his brother's is built. But the main thing is it shows that the tradition says the biggest thing that part of his missionary activity in converting that kingdom was because he was able to um, show that he built a place for him in heaven, maybe because of the faith in Jesus Christ, right? Um, it's a legendary story that's a part of the account. Um, I'm sure you've heard like there's the Acts of Thomas. That's
Mhm.
not what, or the Gospel of Thomas. Those aren't part of the tradition of the church, but those are writing a lot of the legends that come from the fifth, sixth, up to the ninth century of the legends and tales of the missionary work of Saint Thomas, right?
Mhm.
And so, for better or worse, how much is truthful or not. You can say there's a lot of fantastical things or that they're talking about it, but it really highlights for us as Christians from India that there was a very strong belief that St. Thomas was there, right? It's one thing if you just one person just claim, oh, St. Thomas, but when you look out throughout the centuries, time and time again, the person that has brought the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ to India was always Saint Thomas. There was no
Mm.
other saint, no other apostle, no other
Yeah.
disciple, or a descendant of an apostle that's accounted that name, right?
Mhm.
And so it just highlights that Saint Thomas, for better or worse, even though you might not have like physical evidence that dates back to 2,000 years that are now still extant in Kerala or in India, but it shows by just the fact that there's a living community that continues to keep faith in him and to believe in the gospel of Jesus Christ and traces back its history
Mhm.
those many years, millennia, to the time of the preaching of the gospel by the apostles of Jesus Christ. It shows that their community remained because we know that when we look at history as a whole of Christianity, not all places where the apostle went are still remaining today. They're not remaining as Christian places or even as cities anymore, right? And it just shows that uh, um, the little or a great amount of faith that are the communities that are still here today are because of uh, those foundations that were laid by the apostles, right? That we
Mhm.
still have, right? But especially those who claim it, because of the community was always by the grace of God, by the power of the Holy Spirit, and the continuation of the community remaining steadfast and being proactive and keeping the connection with the church. Because which we'll talk later about the how the church remained throughout the centuries. They knew that they were part of something great, right? And there was not just themselves alone, but they connected always back um, to their brothers and sisters in Christ of knowing the church as a whole, so that they can continue to survive, right, and to uh, remain faithful to the faith that had been given to them.
So let me ask you a quick question. Do you know if the brother who came back, did he still live out more of his life, or did he go right back?
Like I said, it doesn't go too clear. It's part of this is legend, right? I never looked directly, what it says about the brother that Gondophar's brother. And like I said, because even when you look at it, when you look in history, there was a king Gondophar's in India, but it's not in southwestern coast of India, where Kerala or where current.
Don't we have a coin?
There's a coin, but it's a kingdom that's in north, like on the northwestern part of India.
Mhm.
That's so that dates back there, so it doesn't go to India. So that doesn't discount that Thomas didn't come down. It just shows that the route that he came could have came through North India and then comes later
Mhm.
down, but it's part of the tradition. Even in Kerala, we talked about Gandhar first that he
Yeah.
built this one palace in heaven for him because uh, it doesn't say which one. And we know throughout centuries there's different kings who take names that could be from north or south and things like that. But the biggest thing is there was always communities um, remaining, and like I said, it's not just even Kerala. Like when you look,
Mhm.
which we look at the path that Saint Thomas took, the trade routes there, like we'll talk about in the Persian church and present day, in Iran and Iraq, all the going back to Turkey, all these places, and like in Edessa, it shows he goes to all these places,
Mhm.
and then they have affinity of Saint Thomas being Saint Thomas Christians, right? Because Saint Thomas had gone and preached to their forefathers at one point or another, at one point in the history of those communities,
Mhm.
and so it just shows that he's very prolific in the distance he went in
Mhm.
preaching. Also, 'cause of all the disciples of Jesus Christ or the apostles of Jesus Christ, I'm pretty sure he's probably the one. He's the one that tradition says that he's gone the farthest.
Mhm.
Like I say, because Archer we say he went all the way to China and back, and
Mhm.
came back to India, right? So then no other apostle I know goes that far, right?
Yeah.
Um, and like I said, historically we can't find the direct footprints of St. Thomas in those places, but we know that it's not impossible. Because one thing I forgot to mention earlier as well, when we look at the scriptures, particularly in the book of Acts, and we look at even the missionary works of St. Paul, when they go to a place, they'll always find the Jewish people of that community first, because
Mhm.
they know that the preaching of the gospel was to the Jews first, because it was in the Old Testament the Messiah was coming in, so they have a responsibility, but also a hope that as they present that Jesus was the Messiah they were waiting for, they'll come and believe in
Mhm.
and become as Christians. And so we know that even to this day, there was a Jewish community living in Kerala, in
Mhm.
present day Cochin or Kochi, and that there even there's a small little area within Kochi that's known as the Jewish area, right? There's a
Mhm.
small synagogue, and now there's not so many remaining now. I think there's like one or two families left,
Mhm.
Jewish families in Kerala. But he said there was a larger community at the time of St. Thomas, and so that it shows that St. Thomas would have been able to come because there would have been a Jewish community for him to visit, to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ to, and to convince about that Christ, Jesus is the Messiah, the Christ, and then convert them as they're willing and able, or as they are willing, and then continue on to the people also in India, right? The
Mhm.
other peoples, the non-Jewish people in India as well, like the Hindus.
Do you know if there was any Jewish communities? Because you said St. Thomas went to India and even China.
Hmm.
Do you know if there are still Jewish communities in China?
Not that I know of. I never heard of a part, because we know that in the Bible talks about how the diaspora they get spread on at different times of when the kingdom or nation of Israel fell, even Old Testament times, even after the time of Christ in 70 AD when the temple was destroyed by the Romans, they dispersed. Um, I've only heard as far as India,
Mhm.
but it wouldn't surprise me because there's a Silk Road that goes all the way from through the North India and it goes into China.
Mhm.
So it wouldn't surprise me that there were also Jewish communities lining that route as well. But not that I've read
Mhm.
specifically that but it wouldn't surprise me that when he goes.
Mhm.
But we do say within the Syriac tradition, which our Malankara Indian Orthodox Church is a part of, we do have Syriac Christians that go all the way to China, right?
Mhm.
Up to the to the coming of the Mongols, coming and the Khanate coming down. There were Christian communities. Even Genghis Khan, it says one of his wives was a Christian,
Mhm.
Syriac Christian, that he had, right? Because there was communities lining that Silk Road, and we say that's because of the work of Saint Thomas beginning it, and then the Syriac Christians continuing on that route,
Mhm.
spreading the message of Jesus Christ. But then after a while, most of those places, those communities, because particularly when the Genghis Khan, the Mongols come down, the Golden Horde, um, a lot of those communities
Mhm.
become are wiped out, except for the small communities and places that we still have to this day.
Earlier, you said how they kind of drew laws, and St. Thomas was chosen to go all the way to the east, right? Or in this case, to the ends of the earth. So, how would they know that there were Jewish communities in India?
It's not necessarily they knew right ahead of time, but as they're going to places, they know that the people of the Jewish people have been dispersed, right?
Mhm.
Um, a lot of places, like even before Christ and before the destruction of the temple, the second temple in 70 AD, we know that when the Assyrians come and the Babylonians come, they're going to get dispersed, right, in different places, and so that it's him being Jewish and he's with with travelers. They'll say, "Oh, some of your people are here," right? It's not hard like when you start speaking language. Just like today, when we travel, you know, different communities, you'll find out your people, kind of, right? Like
Mhm.
we'll say, especially when we joke about Malay people, you'll find Malay people anywhere, right? You just walk around and say, "Oh, Malayali," and then you'll start talking, right?
Mhm.
You look similar, and you'll just find them wherever, whatever city you might go. You kind of gravitate towards people who kind of look like you or sound like you. And
Mhm.
so the same way as St. Thomas is going, he's not necessarily expecting he'll find those Jewish people, but
Mhm.
as he goes there, we know
He just
uh,
discovers them.
that he knows that it's that he'll once he sees them or find to understand that they're there. We just like like we look in the Old Testament, sorry, not in the New Testament, in the Acts of Apostles and the writings of St. Paul, they actively made sure that they didn't leave out, and when they knew there were Jewish people there, they would preach to them
Mhm.
because they know that they might not, because they're outside of what happened in Jerusalem and in Judea, and so they're saying, hey, the Messiah has come in
Mhm.
Jesus Christ, and they preach and show that He is the fulfillment of the Scriptures, and they tell them always, and so the fact that there is an existing Jewish community that goes back to that time of Christ,
Mhm.
like the Jewish people of Kochi, it dates back that far, even before that, right?
Mhm.
And so it says that if Saint Thomas comes, it is it only makes sense that he would have tried to preach them because within that area there's a lot of Christian communities around that part of where Kochi is, like not necessarily specific with that Jewish section is a Kochi, but around it there's Christian communities all around them.
Hmm.
And so they would show that there would be, it makes sense that, St. Thomas would have uh, preached to them just like he was already preaching to the Hindu people there at the time, right? So, and even the Indians would say, hey, they know he's not like them, right? So some of your people are living here, right? This
Hmm.
is your people, okay? Like so then, like once you get to places, you'll find, right, who's your people, like similar to you, right? And
Yeah.
so
So, kind of moving on to the Indo-Persian era, how did the St. Thomas Christians still have connections with the church in Persia?
it's a good question, and I'll say it's not so much how they have it, is more of, we see that from the early church, a lot of the Christian communities are all connected through these trade routes, right? And so that the closest Christian community to India was the church in Persia, right? The communities that were there, and so from the very beginning, the church, the Christians, the St. Thomas Christians of India always had a connection, because also the Christians of Persia also claim, have St. Thomas as the one who's laid the foundation for the church there, right, for them. And so we've always had good relations because we come from the same root, or same apostolic missionary work of St. Thomas, right, of the same apostle. And so, and we start seeing those connections from the very beginning. So in the by the beginning of the fourth century, in some accounts it says in 300 AD, we already see there's the first bishop that's recorded to visit India is from the Persian church, Metropolitan David, and it says he visits India, right? And so then
Hmm.
that's the Persian account, and this is before there's the separation of, Orthodox or Catholic or Nestorian, all those things. This is
Hmm.
even before the first Council of Nicaea, and it accounts in the records that he visits India, right? So that shows a kind of connection, the church in India and the church in Persia. And so they, even after that, by 325 at the first ecumenical council, it's accounted that a Bishop John is representing uh, the great lands, the places of Persia and of Great India. That's how it's accounted in many early documents of the church. Of they're saying who attended the first ecumenical council, and this Bishop John is accounted of representing the Church of Persia and India, showing our close relations um, as a church, right? And so from the very beginning, as you can already start seeing from the beginnings of the fourth century, which is started the beginnings of the church growing exponentially and then becoming an official language of the Roman Empire, and we start seeing the church grow in earnest. Up to that point, we already start seeing the Church of India as being connected with the church in Persia, because we're the ones that are farthest east, right? When you start looking at Christian accounts from the from the Western regions, being particularly the Roman Empire, and so we see that deep connection. And but like I said earlier, part of it is also because we both claim, we both share the Saint Thomas root, and so throughout the centuries, then you start seeing that uh, priests and bishops from Persia would be visiting in India, and then there would be a great connection between the two, and so much so that we start seeing, like, in earnest, and when you start looking at earlier historical records, between the 8th century to about the 14th, 15th century, um, I should say to about the 15th, 16th century, we know that there's a strong connection there. There's accounts of bishops going back and forth between the Persian church and India. And so, if so much so that it looks like that there's no more accounts of records of showing that bishops who are from India or in India. It's the bishops who are from Persia who are administering the church in India, right? So that and so that's where they're visiting, because they're responsible for the churches there, right? But by the time um, the European explorers come, we start seeing that's to start lowering, right? No more
Hmm.
connection, right? Because they're preventing those connections, which we'll talk about later. But it shows from that by the 8th century, we start seeing regular connections of bishops going back, and priests going back and forth, connecting our two in the Persia and the Church India, and so that even that's, the term Catholicos of the East that we have in our church, in the Malankara Orthodox Church, is coming from that title that is also used by the church in Persia. Their church is known also the Catholicos, or the Catholicos Patriarch, right? Because all the other churches either have patriarch or pope. Only churches in the East, be the church in India, the Persian church, and then the Armenian church have the term Catholicos for the head bishop of the church. And so it shows that that very strong connection that we have with them, right? And in addition to that, the use of the Syriac language. Our church is a Syriac church, liturgical church, because that is the liturgical tradition that we're from. And so, uh, when we look at how we pronounce and use Syriac, a lot of the pronunciation that we use in India is closer to the East Syriac, or the Persian Christians and the Syriac Christians in Persia, than the Syriac Christians of Western parts. And so, with all those things put together, you start seeing that there's a shared history amongst all of us. And so then, with that, but then you start seeing, like, when you look at modern times, there's still an existent Chaldean church that's survive that is in Kerala as a St. Thomas Christian community, but of the Chaldean, meaning that's more what we consider now the Persian church to this day. And so we start seeing them as still as a living community in India, right? Even they're a smaller group, but they're still there as well.
So then, was it already established? Saint Thomas, when he did come to India, did he already establish, or did he already ordain people to the priesthood?
So when we look at the early church history, and there's no historical record of who ordained who, right? We know in the churches in the Roman Empire, there's a strong tradition. We know who the successors were, and it doesn't say necessarily ordained. In the early churches, the apostles left their disciples, and they were in charge. Either the church in Rome or the church in Antioch or Alexandria. Each of them had their successors, right? And there, you see that line of apostolic succession. But the church is slowly formalizing of how that's handed down. But we know that they've chosen that, hey, he is the bishop, or the one in charge of overseeing the needs of the church community of that place. So we was same time, since all the early churches we see that, we would understand that the same thing would St. Thomas would do as well. He would have left a successor. Once he continues his apostolic or evangelical work, he leaves a successor in those places, be it in Persia, be it India, and when he goes to China, comes back, right? And so, but we don't know all the dates specifically, right? Of going back, particularly in Indian church, we don't have a strong succession of who those people were, other than we know a community was there. But we know that at some point there was priests, but there was no bishops. So even, like I said, at that first account of Metropolitan David, it says that he's visiting India because of that connection that the church in India has with the Persian church, right? And so, with those connections, at one point we know that we don't necessarily have bishops directly in India, but we know we have that St. Thomas tradition, or the apostolic tradition connecting us with the church in Persia, because we share that same apostolic tradition of being under St. Thomas, right? Or coming from St. Thomas.
Did the church in Persia teach us how to celebrate the liturgy?
Definitely, like I said, we're part of the Syriac tradition. So then the liturgical practice that we have come from the churches that celebrate the Syriac, right? So we know that because of that strong connection, more likely than not, that we were using that same liturgical tradition, which is very similar. Like, there's two. I should mention now. There's two Syriac traditions. There's both East and West. So the church in Persia is more Eastern, or the Eastern liturgical tradition of the Syriac language, and then the church in Antioch is the Western Syriac tradition, right?
Okay, so we have two rites: the East Syriac Rite and the West Syriac Rite.
And so in India, they both come. So, but we see in the early church, more, even though we don't in our Malankara church now, in the Malankara Orthodox Church, we don't use the East Syriac. We use now West Syriac, because that we'll talk about later down the line. We see both as,
But initially, we used the East Syriac Rite.
even though we don't have records showing directly what we used for sure at those times, but we know, but there's records of those traditions, right? And because of the historical accounts of us being so directly connected with the church, it makes sense that that's the tradition we have, right? That would be because that's what the Christians at that time of that part of the world are using, right? And so that would be our position, that we were using Syriac, and then we're being on the eastern side. It only makes sense that we were using the East Syriac tradition more than anything else for at least a good while, up until that we know that after the like we'll talk about later, after the Roman period, the European explorers come, and then now we're needing to revive our tradition, and it's from the West Syriac Church, the churches of the West Syriac tradition that come and support us, and then we come fully now with only using or exclusively using the West Syriac tradition from that point forward. That goes about the 16th, 17th century to today.
So then you said that I want to say in the 4th century is when we have like the first historical records of the bishop of Persia coming to India.
Not, and it's from their church record, right? They
Mhm.
show that a bishop from Metropolitan David comes and visits the church
Yeah.
in India. It doesn't where in India, so that he has that responsibility that he's coming and visiting the church in India, and so
Can we assume that the bishop before Metropolitan David visited India, or like in order for them to teach us the liturgy?
for sure, because we're having connection, right? Because like I said, the when you look at the early church as a whole, not just in church in India,
Mhm.
there's three major liturgical traditions. In the West, meaning the Western Roman Empire is Latin.
Mhm.
So from like Italy going west,
Yeah.
right? It's Latin. And then from Constantinople and the churches of the eastern side of the Roman Empire, going east, going a little bit north, going towards like Russia, going south towards the African continent, it's Greek.
Mhm.
Not fully Greek, but not all of Africa. But like I said, it's Greek, right?
Mhm.
And then from the far eastern regions of the Roman Empire, that's just on the border. There's going to the where the Persian Roman Empire border are. It's Syriac, like from
Mhm.
like Antioch, Odessa, east going towards India. It's Syriac is is the language used for worship, right?
Mhm.
And so our church falls under that because even now modern parts of India, the languages now that are spoken in all the as the majority language of the different states come a lot later. Even in Malayalam or in Kerala, where is language of our church in Malankara, where we're based out of, Malayalam also only comes a lot later, only after the St.
Like
Thomas comes.
14th century.
Right. So the modern Malayalam, right? There's
Oh, that's
pre-Malayalam,
yeah.
but the modern Malayalam only comes later, right?
Yeah.
And so we know that that was the language that was used for worship, right? Because there was because even in India, they understand there's the local language and there's a worshiping language.
Yeah.
So for Hindus, there's the local language of the villages, but the worshiping language was Sanskrit. The very like the spiritual and the liturgical books for Hinduism was written in Sanskrit, and that's what they chanted, right? And so a lot of the Indian languages have that in common. Even Malayalam itself too has a lot of Sanskrit words. So for Christians, the language used in the eastern side in the part of the world was Syriac,
Mhm.
and so that our church in India, it only makes it when you look just Christianity as a whole, history as a whole, it would fall under the Syriac liturgical tradition,
Mhm.
and then with like we were saying earlier, within that tradition, we have there's a variation of East and West, right?
Yeah.
And so in India, we didn't make because we don't make distinction of East and West. We know we've used both,
Mhm.
because even in the in Persia and in the eastern regions of the Roman Empire, like be it the word and that fluctuates. Even East and West mingle a lot together in present day, like Iraq. Uh, Both East and West are being used, right?
Mhm.
Depending on the community and who they fall under. And so the church in India also understood both, right?
Mhm.
And so whoever the majority was coming, for sure they would use it. Um, and the community always understood that that was the language for worship, right?
Mhm.
And only till later that we start translating into the vernacular of the people. It was preaching would be in the vernacular, but the worship would be in the main language, right?
So we know that the church in Persia helped us by, or their Metropolitan David come to see how we were doing as a community. We know that they helped us practice or instituted the East Syriac Rite.
Well, so it's not necessarily they instituted. I'll say like it's not just him. Throughout the century, we know other bishops have come. So when they come, we share like we share the same liturgical language. They would have no problem worshiping with us because we share the same one, right?
Mhm.
And at the same time, but then because at one point when they're the bishops administering, they would also make sure that we're being taught the proper
The proper faith.
or making sure that we're remaining faithful to what's being uh, agreed upon. When you have these ecumenical councils, we're not, India's very far from where these ecumenical councils are
Mhm.
happening, but it's being transmitted through the church, right? And making sure that, with the Nicene Creed and the practices, the canons of the church are being passed down, right?
Mhm.
From and we're connecting through them, right? And sharing the liturgy and the the Eucharist together with them, right? The communion. So
So then let me ask you this: how else did the church in Persia help us?
so that's a good question. So the biggest thing always, first and foremost, is they helped us maintain an apostolic connection, right,
Hmm.
with our bishops. Um, and at the same time, they were a sister. They were a Christian that made us stay connected with the rest of Christianity too, as well, right? Because we're as India is farther one of the farther away Christian communities. We're not as close to the where the majority of Christians were living.
Hmm.
They are our connection to the about the canons of the church, like the Nicene Creed and things like that, right? That is our connection to saying we're remaining faithful. That's so much so that, like like I said, or I should say, we'll talk about later, when the Portuguese come and they recognize we're Christian communities, but they say you don't know the Pope. It's like our thing wasn't about the Pope; it's about the faith, right?
Hmm.
It was so that that's there's certain things that they do under that are given, and they say our bishop is coming from Persia, like the head of their church is in Persia, right? We don't. That's how we're remaining. Uh, as when we talk about Catholic being universal, the universal faith, that is where we're keeping our connection to, not some bishop in Rome, but which we're not denying that he's part of the community, right? It's
Hmm.
about connecting as a through our sisters and brothers sisters from the churches that we're remaining the same faith, right?
Hmm.
And so, um, that's what we kind of we're remaining faithful. Like the church closest to us, we've always been in good relation with them, right?
Hmm.
And so, um, it just shows that we would hearken back to them, right? That the same. This is how we're saying we're not just an isolated church that has no connection to anyone else.
Hmm.
They were said they are our bridge to saying that how we connect to the rest of the Christian community as a whole around the world. If that makes sense.
So then, because our connection to the other churches was through the Persian church, were we not practicing Nestorianism?
More likely than not, yes, right? But at the same time, we'll say that the Church in India, no one calls it Nestorianism, right?
Hmm.
Like even Nestorians, the people we label as Nestorian churches don't say we're Nestorian churches. They just say they're Church of the East, and that their liturgical tradition just reflects uh, the teachings of that are faithful to what's been handed down, right?
The churches of the East still believed in Nestorianism, correct?
Or they still they don't consider him a heretic, right?
Hmm.
And they believe Saint Mary's a saint,
Hmm.
but they won't call her God bearer. They won't call
Okay.
her Theotokos, right? They think it's better just to call her,
But wouldn't that mean that if we accept, that means during that time period we were, I guess, in a sense, being heretical?
being under the church. Yes, we could say that we're heretical to the point of sense that we are actively against what the whole church is teaching. That's the church that we're worshiping with. We're not actively saying, hey, we don't think God is Mary is a God bearer. It's just that that's the liturgical worship is being presented that because there's no writings in India that says that we actively were agreeing with this story saying, hey, we can't call Mary the mother of God
Hmm.
because at the same time as the church and uh, the church, the Persia church is now leaning more Nestorian. There's also a Syriac tradition, a church of the Syriac tradition within Persia who are also that agreed with the Council of Ephesus,
Hmm.
remaining in the same place as in Persia, and they also had bishops and priests coming to Kerala
Hmm.
off and on, right? And so the biggest indicator for us uh, in India, but when we say we never denied Saint Mary being uh, the the bearer of God or of Jesus, right?
Hmm.
And so that when you look at all the early churches of that are established by Saint Thomas, one thing that they have in common is who are they named after? Because you would think of, oh, they're all Saint Thomas churches, right? But they're not. They're all named after Saint Mary
Hmm.
from those points. Because the main thing is because even you look at the early church, almost all churches, it only comes later when we start naming churches after saints, and like even in the Roman Empire, because they would build churches on top of their tombs, because that's historically where the community would gather to pray, and so. But when the apostles established first churches, the saint that they knew was Saint Mary. So then those churches historically became Saint Mary's churches. So then
Hmm.
even when we look at this church established by Saint Thomas, the original seven, majority they're all named in the name of Saint Mary.
Oh.
And so it's like it wasn't a lack of belief in Saint, of understanding who Saint Mary was, right? But like I said, the nuance was there. But we say for sure, we can't say one way or another that we're being actively heretical. But for sure we use the East Rite tradition worship,
Hmm.
right? And so, but that's why when the Portuguese come, um, with the Roman missionaries. So, oh, you guys are using this Syriac, which they had experience with the Syriac church as well too. All your liturgical worship is Nestorian leaning, so you can't use that. But we're saying, but then so they start incorporating Latin. But the church in India is like, we don't know the Latin tradition. That wasn't the faith of the church for the centuries. So they knew it has to be Syriac.
So then let me ask you this. What elements of the church in Persia do we still see today?
So the biggest one is when you look at the St. Thomas cross, what we claim as the St. Thomas cross is the cross within a lotus flower. That's very much a very similar to what the East Syriac church traditions use. The flowery look and how the cross is arranged. That's very much East Syriac, which is more influenced by from the Indian side, but it's very much East Syriac level, like way of writing, of drawing or making a cross. That's one. Behind this. Okay, yeah. Oh, actually, I'll pull that up. Actually, I'll show that one. Yeah. So I forgot we had one here. And this is labeled as the St. Thomas cross. So the cross with the dove descending on top of the cross with the lotus flower or angel's wings. That's written both ways. Flung from the bottom, come from that East Syriac tradition of churches, and so that's one. But we claim that it's St. Thomas cross, but we know that's coming from the East Syriac influence, right? It's developed more like lotus flowers. Lotus is more Indian, and so that we've made it our own. But it's an influence from the East Syriac tradition. And the second is, even in our church to this day, in Kerala or in the Malankara church, pronunciation of Syriac words, you know, you know, East Syriac uses the A sound or the A sound at the end for, like we say sliba, kurbana. That's East Syriac, whereas West Syriac would be slibo, kurbono. It has an O sound. So the Church of Malankara still uses the East Syriac pronunciation rather than, even though we use West Syriac tradition now exclusively, we still use the East Syriac pronunciation. So that shows still that our connection or affinity that was still coming from the East Syriac part of the tradition, right, of the Syriac tradition, right? So we still have those kind of things, like of showing that what our connection was. And like I said earlier, there's still an existing Church of the East still remaining in India, particularly in Kerala, based on Thrissur, that are part of the Chaldean Church, and so then they're still living there. And the same thing even amongst the Catholic communities, when the rites there of the Syro-Malabar Church, they also still use the East Syriac, the liturgical tradition. They blend the East Syriac with the Latin rite, the Latin traditions, but using the East Syriac as the base for the liturgical worship.